When a country is born, maybe its biggest test is how it deals with the rest of the world. Today, we're jumping into the incredible story of how a newly independent India, full of ideals and big dreams, had to navigate a really treacherous global stage, a world defined by conflict, superpowers, and the beginning of a whole new era.
And this quote right here from India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, just perfectly sets the stage. For him, real freedom wasn't just about ruling yourself. It was about having your own voice in the world, making your own choices, and not letting anyone else tell you what to do. The stakes were incredibly high from the very first day.
So here's our roadmap for today. We're going to start with how India tried to carve out its own unique path. Then we'll dive into its radical idea of non-alignment. And after that, we'll see how brutal conflicts with China and Pakistan forced this huge shift from pure idealism to some really hard-nosed realism, a journey that eventually leads us to the nuclear question.
All right, so let's set the scene. It's 1947. India finally gets its independence and steps onto the world stage. But what kind of world was it walking into?
Well, it was a world that was literally split in two. You had the United States and the Soviet Union locked in this massive Cold War. And they were basically telling every other country, you're either with us or you're against us. And at the very same time, India was dealing with its own huge challenges: the trauma of partition, crippling poverty, and the massive task of building a democracy from the ground up.
So in this incredibly complicated world, Nehru's government boiled it all down to three basic goals. Number one, protect the freedom they had just fought so hard for. Two, make sure the nation's borders were secure. And three, probably the most important, focus everything on economic development to lift millions of people out of poverty. Every single foreign policy choice was weighed against these three things.
Okay, so how do you even begin to do all that when two global giants are trying to pull you into their team? Well, India's answer was pretty bold and honestly kind of radical for its time: non-alignment.
Now, this is super important. Non-alignment didn't mean hiding from the world or just being neutral. Not at all. It was an active policy. It meant India would engage with everyone, but on its own terms, judging every international issue based on what was right, not on what Washington or Moscow wanted. This was basically India's declaration of strategic independence.
And this really shows you the tough spot India was in. On one side, you had the US and its allies, who said they were all about democracy. On the other, the Soviet bloc, which presented itself as the big enemy of colonialism. Both of these things sounded pretty good to a new country like India. But Nehru saw that, at the end of the day, they were both military alliances that demanded total loyalty. India refused to be a chess piece in their game.
And India didn't just practice this idea for itself, it became a champion for it around the globe. This all came together at the historic Bandung Conference in 1955. For the very first time, leaders from 29 new nations across Asia and Africa got together and realized, hey, we don't have to choose between capitalism and communism. This meeting was the seed that grew into the non-aligned movement, creating what was basically a third bloc, a powerful, united voice for the developing world. But this idealistic vision of a peaceful, non-aligned world, well, it was about to get a brutal reality check right on India's own doorstep. The relationship with its massive neighbor to the north, China, was about to take a truly devastating turn. You know, the relationship started with so much promise. In 1954, they even signed this thing called the Panchashil Agreement, basically the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. But things went south. After China took over Tibet, India gave asylum to the Dalai Lama in 1959, and Beijing saw that as a huge provocation. That, plus some long-running border disputes, led to a shocking, full-scale invasion by China in October of 1962. The result of that war was nothing less than a national humiliation. India was completely caught off guard, and the defeat was a massive psychological blow. The feeling of being betrayed was huge, and it just shattered a lot of that early optimism that had defined India's foreign policy.
The fallout was just immense. India's image on the world stage took a serious hit. At home, Nehru himself, who had been the biggest champion of friendship with China, was heavily criticized. The defense minister had to resign. But here's the most important consequence. The 1962 war forced a total rethink. India realized that idealism alone wasn't enough. You needed military muscle. And that led to a huge push to modernize the armed forces.
But that wake-up call from China wasn't the only fire India had to put out. The relationship with Pakistan, a nation born from the very same painful partition, was filled with conflict right from the start. The fight over Kashmir led to wars in 1947 and again in '65.
But the conflict that would completely change the map of the subcontinent was the 1971 war. And this crisis didn't start in Kashmir, it started in what was then called East Pakistan.
8 million. Just think about that number for a second. That's how many refugees flooded into India in 1971. They were fleeing a horrifying military crackdown by the Pakistani army in East Pakistan. For India, this wasn't just some political problem. It was a massive humanitarian and economic crisis.
So here's how it all went down. It started with an election. The Bengali party from East Pakistan won a clear majority, but the leaders in West Pakistan just refused to accept it. What came next was a brutal military assault. As millions of refugees poured into India, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi made a really smart, strategic move. She signed a friendship treaty with the Soviet Union, which basically neutralized any support for Pakistan from the US and China. With her back covered, India launched a lightning-fast, decisive military campaign. The result? The Pakistani army surrendered in Dhaka, and a new country, Bangladesh, was born.
So you have this huge military victory, but it's combined with that earlier shock from China. All of this led to the final major evolution in India's early foreign policy, a totally pragmatic new look at its position on nuclear technology.
You see, by the late 60s, the 5 countries that already had nuclear weapons tried to create an exclusive club with something called the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But India looked at this and said, hold on a second, this is totally unfair. Why should a few countries get to have these weapons for their security while telling everyone else they can't? India called the NPT discriminatory and flat out refused to sign it.
And this timeline really shows you how the thinking changed. India's nuclear program, which started way back in the 40s, was always supposed to be for peaceful things like generating electricity. But in October 1964, the game changed. China, the country they just fought a war with, tested its own nuclear bomb. Suddenly, the entire strategic picture looked different. A decade later, in May 1974, India answered with its own nuclear test, though they were careful to call it a peaceful explosion.
And that's really the heart of it. India's nuclear test wasn't some sudden decision. It was the endpoint of a long journey, a journey away from the high ideals of a world without war, and toward the hard-headed pragmatism you need to survive in a neighborhood that had proven to be pretty dangerous.
And that really leaves us with a final big question, one that sums up India's journey, and really the journey of so many countries. In a dangerous and unpredictable world, is holding on to your ideals a luxury you can't afford? Or is it the very thing that makes your survival worth fighting for?